A 14th century woman watered a pot of basil every single day, and buried inside the soil was the severed head of the man she loved. You clicked on basil history and now you are getting a severed head. I know, but here is the thing. That image is not a horror story. It is, the exact moment basil stopped being just an herb and became something much harder to shake. And once you see what people did with this plant across 2,000 years, what they buried beneath it, what ritual words they spoke over it before pressing it into the ground, what physicians feared about it in the same breath they prescribed it, the leaf you tear into a salad without a second thought becomes something you cannot quite look at the same way again. Most people think Basil's story begins somewhere on the Ligurian coast with a mortar and a very photogenic sauce. The actual story begins in a Greek garden in summer heat almost 2,400 years ago, and then passes through Roman ritual abuse, medieval literary tragedy, a Renaissance print shop, and a harbour kitchen in Genoa that, when it finally wrote down the first pesto recipe in history, quietly admitted that you could use something else entirely if basil happened to be unavailable. That single clause changes everything you thought you knew about the sauce. And we are going to get there. Here is what nobody tells you about basil. Before it became beloved, before it became Italian, before it became the leaf you grow in a pot on the kitchen counter and tear into everything from April through September, it was cursed. Actually, literally cursed. And the people doing the cursing were not witches or priests. They were Roman farmers, doing what Roman farmers apparently did every single planting season with complete and total seriousness. The Roman writer Pliny the Elder, writing around 77 CE, puts this into his natural history like it is the most ordinary thing in the world. No seed, he says, is more prolific than basil. And then, immediately after that observation, he records the following. It was recommended to sow basil with curses and imprecations, specifically so that it would come up more abundantly. After sowing, the earth was to be rammed down hard. He also records that basil was best sown at the Feast of Pails, a Roman pastoral festival tied to the sacred calendar of the herding year. Let that land for a second. Roman farmers stood over their garden beds, spoke abuse at the seeds in the soil, then physically stamped the ground flat. And they did it because they believed, or were at minimum willing to act as if they believed, that the curse made the basil grow better. Picture the scene, and not the marble column version of Rome, because that is not what Rome actually looked like most of the time. A working garden, broken soil, summer dust on every surface, heat that makes the air above the earth shift and blur. A grower who has probably done this before leans over the bed and mutters something harsh toward the seed. Maybe he laughs while doing it. Maybe he does not believe the words at all and says them anyway, because basil is exactly the kind of plant around which custom accumulates faster than certainty. He has seen his father do this. His father probably saw someone do it before him. Then he stamps the earth. Hard. Flat. Sealed under pressure. The seed goes into the ground under abuse, under ritual timing, under half-believed formula spoken aloud to a plant that has no ears. And reportedly, somehow, it responded. What makes this worth stopping at is not that it is strange, it is that Pliny records it as widespread practice. He is writing an encyclopedia of the known world, a man cataloguing elephants and gemstones in military campaigns. He pauses and writes down the basil curse because enough people are doing it for the practice to be socially real. It has been passed down long enough to count as tradition. This is the clearest early sign of something basil does throughout its entire history. It makes people behave in ways that are almost impossible to justify, and equally impossible to stop. But where did that behaviour come from? Why basil specifically, not thyme, not coriander, not any of the dozens of other herbs in a Roman garden? Why did basil become the plant you had to abuse into growing? To understand that, you need to go back roughly 4 centuries before Pliny. Back to the first person who wrote basil down without mythology, without ritual, without anything supernatural at all. Back to a Greek garden in summer, late in the 4th century BCE, where a man named Theophrastus is trying very hard to make plants make sense. Start with the honest thing about basil's starting point. We do not actually know where it came from. Taxonomists today can give you the accepted native range, tropical and subtropical Asia to northern Australia. But the wider genus, Ocimum, is richest in Africa, and some modern historical syntheses argue the genus may have originated there, with domestication of sweet basil later linked to India. So the first line of Basil's story is not certainty, it is argument. Before empires named it, before cooks bruised it in mortars, basil belonged to hot ground and sun-struck air, the botanical world whose human map would only later be drawn. Which makes Theophrastus, student of Aristotle and the first serious botanist in the Western written record, all the more important. Around 325 BCE, he publishes Inquiry into Plants. It is a project of patient, deliberate unmystery. He wants to understand plants through observation alone, and basil appears there not as a wonder, not as a plant with ritual associations, not as anything unusual. It appears as a known quantity. He notes the season of sowing, repeated sowing through the growing year, swift germination. He mentions that growers say basil responds especially well when first watered with warm water, even at noon in the full heat of summer. That is it. No ceremony, just the practical habits of people who have already made this herb ordinary through years of use. You only write about watering temperature. If enough people are already debating watering temperature. You only note repeated sowings if repeated sowings are already established practice. Theophrastus writes about basil the way you write about things that have become completely routine, because basil has. It enters the written record already old, already familiar, already one of the plants by which a household is measured against the season. But Theophrastus also notices something that quietly sets the terms for the next 1,000 years of basil's history. The herb is fast, suspiciously fast. It answers quickly, it yields abundantly, and there is something about a plant that responds so readily, that meets human desire with such apparent willingness, that begins over centuries to make people nervous. The more a plant seems to respond, the more people are tempted to imagine it listening. By the time the Romans get to basil, they have had 4 centuries to let that suspicion develop into something spectacular. Which brings us back to the curses, and to a much older anxiety. What do you do with something you need, but cannot quite control? By the 1st century CE, the physicians had an answer to that question. You prescribe it. Carefully. You define the correct dose. You note the contraindications, and you write it all down in language that makes it sound completely under control, while describing something that is, at its core, completely not. Around 77 CE, the Greek physician Dioscorides writes De Materia Medica, one of the most influential medical texts in history, consulted as an authority for the following 1400 years. Basil appears in it under the name Ocimum, and Dioscorides is precise and almost cold about it. Eaten in quantity, he says, it dulls the eyesight and is hard to digest. And yet, taken in the right amount, it softens the belly, moves wind, provokes urine, encourages milk. Applied externally with rose oil, polenta flower and vinegar, it is said to address inflammations and the stings of the sea dragon and the scorpion. Its juice, mixed in the older pharmacological way, is recommended for eye complaints. Hold those 2 halves together. Too much basil damages your sight. The right amount helps it. Same plant, same leaf. The dosage is everything, and the line between remedy and harm runs directly through the herb. That double character does not disappear after antiquity. It survives for centuries. By 1653, Nicholas Culpeper, writing cheap vernacular herbals for English readers, locked out of elite medical institutions, is still carrying this same tension. He calls basil hot and moist. He lists uses. It cheers the heart, strengthens a moist stomach, drives away melancholy, provokes urine. And elsewhere in the broader Culpeper tradition, basil is connected to Mars, to Scorpio, to venom and argument. The same herb that heals also belongs, in the astrological shorthand of his age, to the symbolic register of aggression and danger. What Culpeper is doing is also something politically significant. A cheap English herbal, affordable enough for ordinary households, meant that knowledge about plants could cross social thresholds that had previously been firmly closed. Households that could not command a physician could still grow herbs and consult a printed page. When Basil appears in Culpeper, it appears at the exact point where medical language becomes socially available to the people who had been excluded from it. Basil becomes part of a quiet struggle over who gets to say what plants are for. The double herb, useful and suspect, beautiful and anxiety-inducing, is not a contradiction in Basil's character. It is its core identity across most of its documented history. The stronger the scent, the stronger the promise. The stronger the promise, the greater the fear of getting it wrong. And that fear, carried forward across centuries in herbals and household practice, is part of what kept Basil close to human attention long after simpler herbs had quietly faded. So by the medieval period, Basil is cultivated, medicated, ritualized, and feared in more or less equal measure. It has been growing in human hands for centuries. What it has not done yet is enter the imagination at the level that actually changes an ingredient's long-term history. What it has not done is become literature. That is about to change, and when it does, in 1353, it happens in the most violent and most beautiful way you could possibly imagine. Giovanni Boccaccio sets down one of the most disturbing images in the history of food. In the Decameron, a book written during the plague years for people watching their world come apart, a young woman named Lisabetta loses her lover, a man named Lorenzo murdered by her own brothers. Guided by a dream, she finds the body buried in the earth, and in an act that can only be grief with nowhere left to go, she cuts off the head, wraps it, carries it home, and places it inside a pot of soil. Over it she plants what Boccaccio calls the goodliest basil of Salerno. Then she waters it every single day, with her tears, with rose water, with perfumed water, and the basil grows beautiful, lush, fragrant, impossible. The plant flourishes because of what is buried beneath it. The beauty is inseparable from what feeds it. And Boccaccio chose basil specifically, not lavender, not rosemary, not any other herb of the Mediterranean world, because by 1353, basil already carried something other herbs did not. It was a plant people associated with intensity, with love that exceeded its own vessel, with something that could not stay inside ordinary life. The story circulates. It moves across Italian cities and into other languages. It enters poetry and visual art across the following centuries. And in doing so, it does something that seeds alone cannot do. It makes basil emotionally portable. A reader in another city, another century, may never touch Lisabetta's soil, but the emotional charge has already travelled. Seeds carry genes. Words carry meaning. And meaning, once attached to a plant, is extraordinarily difficult to remove. This is the pivot moment in basil's entire history. Before Boccaccio, basil is cultivated, medicated, and ritualized. After Boccaccio, basil is also literary. It has entered prestige culture at the register of tragedy, and once an herb enters literature at that level, its charge travels farther than any trade route could carry it alone. A herb can exist in a poem before it is in a kitchen. The poem gets there first. And the poem changes what happens in the kitchen for centuries afterward. That kind of literary charge needs a delivery system. It needs something to carry it across distance, across language, across centuries, to people who may never meet a living basil plant. In the 16th century, that delivery system arrived, and it was made of ink, pressed paper, and wood blocks carved from life. In 1542, a German botanist named Leonhart Fuchs publishes the Historia Stirpium, one of the great illustrated herbals of early modern Europe, printed in Basel. The woodcuts are drawn from life. For the first time, basil can travel not only as seed or lore or culinary habit, but as image. A person can know basil because a reputable book has taught their eye what basil is supposed to look like. You do not need to grow it. You do not need to live near anyone who does. You just need access to a printed page. Picture a print shop in the 1540s. Oil on woodblocks, paper stacked in reams, pages pressed one after another. The herb that once depended on physical proximity, on being handed to you by someone who already knew it, now acquires reproducibility. Basil's leaves, stems, flowers and growing habit can be copied, sold and studied across the entire continent by people who may never have grown it themselves. The herb enters the Republic of Letters by way of the workshop. By 1597, John Gerard's Herbal secures basil inside English herbal culture. Gerard's project was not purely botanical, it was domestic, medicinal, linguistic and practical. Herbals like his trained readers to recognize, grow, discuss and use plants inside the household economy of early modern life. One of the signs that the plant has truly spread, is not merely that it grows in many places. It is that many vernaculars now have room for it. Basil in Gerard is being absorbed into the world of a country that can grow it only in pots, with effort, against the climate's natural inclinations. That effort is a kind of tribute. In 1753, Carl Linnaeus formally publishes Ocimum Basilicum in Species Plantarum. With that act, basil enters the stabilizing machinery of modern botanical nomenclature. To give a plant a standardized scientific name is to tighten the frame around what kind of thing is being discussed, traded, bred, and studied across learned institutions worldwide. And yet, and this is what makes basil basil, it is not the end of ambiguity. Related basils continue to multiply. Overlapping vernaculars persist across regions. Local selections alter aroma, leaf shape and habit across centuries of continued cultivation. The binomial is an achievement. It is not a resolution. The plant slips the frame every time someone turns their back. Basil remains one thing in Latin and many things in lived history. Then, quietly on the other side of the Atlantic, something happens that has nothing to do with poetry or print or nomenclature. Something happens in a nurseryman's broadsheet and in a letter about pot herbs. And it is, I think, the most underrated kind of transformation a plant can go through, because it is the transformation into paperwork. In 1810, a Philadelphia nurseryman named Bernard McMahon lists basil seed for sale. In 1820, a man named George Divers writes to Thomas Jefferson, naming sweet basil among the pot herbs he cannot supply. Another document places basil at the Washington market, purchased and cooked with venison in Jefferson's own presidential household. These are not dramatic scenes. They are, better than dramatic scenes. They are scenes of incorporation. Seed for sale, herb in a market, herb in correspondence, herb in a kitchen cooking game. There is a stage in any ingredient's history that anyone who cares about food should attend to carefully. The moment when something becomes bureaucratically boring. When it appears not in poems or pharmacopoeias but in supply lists and letters. When it is ordinary enough to be requested and complained about when unavailable. That is when a plant has actually arrived. Basil, in the early American Republic, has crossed from curiosity to supply chain. It has become paperwork. And paperwork, is the quietest and most permanent kind of victory an herb can have. So now basil is cultivated, medicated, ritualized, literary, printed, named, and administrative. It has crossed an ocean. It is in letters about vegetables. What it has not yet done, not in print, not in any form the historical record can hold, is become pesto. And when it finally does, in 1863, in a Genoese cookbook, the recipe says something that all the canonical mythology of that sauce has spent the following century and a half trying very hard to forget. In 1863, a Genoese gastronomist named Giovanni Battista Ratto publishes La Cuciniera Genovese. In it, he records a preparation called battuto alla Genovese. Take garlic, take basil, or, if basil is lacking, marjoram and parsley. Take Dutch cheese and Parmigiano, grated and mixed, together. Pine nuts. Pound everything in a mortar with a little butter until reduced to a paste, then loosen with abundant fine oil. That is the first secure printed pesto milestone in the historical record, and the most important words in it are not basil. They are, or if basil is lacking. That single clause opens an entire world, you know. Basil is central to the sauce, but not unconditional, not guaranteed year-round, not absolute. The sauce belongs to a coastal city where improvisation and longing coexist in equal measure. Dutch cheese is in the mortar because Genoa is a port, and maritime trade enters the recipe alongside local leaves. Butter is still present before the simplifications that later canonical memory will impose. Pesto in 1863 is not the polished, unchanging icon that later centuries will retroactively pretend it always was. It is regional, seasonal, practical, alive with compromise. Close in on that kitchen for a moment. A marble mortar on a work surface. Garlic yielding first under the pestle, the sharpest note, the foundation of everything that follows. Pine nuts catching and breaking beneath the pressure. Basil added in sequence, not carelessly, because the order is part of what protects the perfume. Parmigiano falling in pale dust. Oil drawn in slowly, loosening the compressed mass into something that catches the light. Outside the kitchen window, a harbour city still hears rope and gull and the hard noise of commerce. Inside, the herb is being transformed, pounded until the leaf gives up colour, scent, and individual identity to become flavour at a scale larger than itself. This is basil's culinary apotheosis before the modern era, not chopped into a dish, not scattered as garnish, but made into the soul of a sauce, worked until the boundary between leaf and liquid dissolves. And yet the recipe, at its very moment of canonization, leaves the door open. If basil is lacking, the plant that spent 2,000 years refusing to be fixed to any single register of human value slips out of its own definition one more time. In 1883, a French horticultural firm called Vilmorin-Andrieux publishes Les Plantes Potagères, a catalogue of garden vegetables, and in it, almost as a passing remark, they describe fine green basil as especially suited to pot culture, very often seen at the windows of the humblest households, particularly in warm countries. They also catalogue multiple basil, purple bush basil, tree basil identified there with Ocimum gratissimum, varieties sorted by colour and habit and use, an entire family of selections moving through horticultural commerce like a quiet diversification no single history had planned for. But it is the window detail that stays with you. A pot, light falling through glass, heat rising from a street in southern Europe. A household that may not possess much else still keeps this fresh, penetrating green on the sill. After 2,000 years of cursed seeds, severed heads, ancient pharmacology, Renaissance print shops, and the compromise mortar of Genova, basil ends up in the window of an ordinary room, not in a great kitchen, not in a great text, in a window where it is beautiful, where it is fragrant, where it is possible. That is, I think, where you finally see what this plant actually is. Not the herb of courts, or tragedy, or science, or any single cuisine. Something that kept offering itself to whoever needed something from it. A Greek gardener found vigour. A Roman found ritual. A physician found remedy and danger in the same handful of leaves. A woman in a story found a tomb that could flower. A printer found a specimen worth fixing in ink. A Genoese cook found a season that could be pounded into permanence. A poor household found beauty at the window when beauty was the one thing still available. The Vilmorin catalogue lists several basils, not one, as though the plant had decided a long time ago that a single identity was never quite the point. It refused to be fixed in Pliny's garden. It refused to be fixed in Boccaccio's pot. It refused to stay fixed in the canonical recipe that tried to claim it. Here is the hidden connection the whole story has been circling. Basil did not survive 2,000 years because it was useful. It survived because it was useful and literary and ritualistic and medicinal and tragic and ordinary, sometimes all at once, sometimes in the same afternoon, in the same kitchen, in the same pot. And the plant that got cursed into the ground and watered with tears and listed in a nurseryman's broadsheet and substituted when unavailable is the same plant on every supermarket shelf in the world right now. That is not a straight line. That is a series of rebirths, and Basil is still in the middle of one. Was there a smell that reached you somewhere before you had words for it? Something growing in a garden or on a windowsill or in someone else's kitchen, and the plant behind it has never quite let you go. Tell me that moment. Tell me what it was and where you were. If you stay for this kind of history, subscribe.